The desert night was pitch black as I drove along the lonely highway cutting through the Navajo Nation. The headlights of my beat-up pickup truck barely illuminated the road ahead, and an eerie stillness hung in the air. I'd been on the road for hours, having left my life in the city behind to take a job on a ranch deep in the heart of the reservation. As I navigated the winding roads, my mind wandered to the events that had led me here. I'd always felt like an outsider in the bustling urban world, never quite fitting in with the fast-paced lifestyle and constant noise. When I stumbled across an ad for a ranch hand position on the reservation, something inside me stirred. It felt like a call to return to my roots, to reconnect with the land and the traditions of my ancestors. The radio crackled with static, breaking the silence and jolting me back to the present. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear station, but only caught fragments of words and music. Giving up, I switched it off and continued driving in silence. As the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, I finally spotted the turnoff for the ranch. A weathered wooden sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the entrance to what would be my new home. I turned onto the dirt road, the truck bouncing and rattling as I made my way towards the main house. The ranch sprawled out before me, a collection of modest buildings surrounded by vast expanses of scrubland and distant mesas. As I pulled up to the house, an old man emerged from the front door, his face lined with years of sun and hard work. This, I assumed, must be Duncan, the ranch owner who had hired me over the phone. "You made it," he said gruffly as I stepped out of the truck. His eyes, sharp and alert despite his age, scanned me from head to toe. "Thought you might have changed your mind." I shook my head. "No, sir. I'm here to work." Duncan nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Get your things inside. We start at sunrise." The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and adjustment to ranch life. Duncan proved to be a stern but fair boss, teaching me the ins and outs of managing the livestock and maintaining the property. The work was backbreaking, but I found a sense of satisfaction in it that I'd never experienced in my previous jobs. As I settled into life on the ranch, I began to notice things. Small things at first, shadows moving at the corner of my vision, whispers on the wind that didn't quite sound like the breeze. I chalked it up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination, but as time went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, as Duncan and I sat on the porch after a long day's work, I finally worked up the courage to ask him about it. "Duncan," I began hesitantly, "have you ever seen anything strange out here?" The old man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might laugh it off or tell me I was being ridiculous. Instead, he took a long sip of his coffee and stared out at the darkening landscape. "This land," he said slowly, "it's old. Older than you or me, older than the reservation, older than the Navajo people themselves. It's got its own spirit, its own life force, you might say. And sometimes that force makes itself known." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. "What do you mean?" Duncan turned to look at me, his expression grave. "I mean that there are things out there that most people don't believe in anymore. Things that our ancestors knew and respected. Things that we've forgotten, to our peril." Over the next few months, Duncan began to share more of the old stories with me. Tales of skinwalkers and other supernatural beings that were said to roam the reservation. At first I listened with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. But as time went on, and as my own strange experiences continued, I found myself believing more and more. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything changed. Duncan and I had been out checking the fences on the far edge of the property, an area we didn't visit often. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, I felt a sudden unease settle over me. "Duncan," I said, my voice tight, "I think we should head back." The old man nodded, his own expression tense. "I feel it too. Let's go." We mounted our horses and began to ride back towards the ranch house. The shadows seemed to deepen around us, and an unnatural silence fell over the land. Even the usual evening sounds of insects and night birds were absent. Suddenly, my horse reared, nearly throwing me from the saddle. I managed to hold on, but as I looked up, my blood ran cold. There, standing in the path before us, was a figure that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, and its head was that of a coyote, but with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. "Skinwalker," Duncan whispered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and awe. The creature tilted its head, regarding us with those eerie glowing eyes. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You do not belong here," it said, the words echoing in my mind rather than my ears. Duncan straightened in his saddle, his face set in determination. "We have as much right to this land as you do, Spirit," he replied firmly. The skinwalker's mouth opened in what might have been a grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Do you?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. "Then prove it." What happened next was a blur of action and terror. The skinwalker lunged at us, moving with impossible speed. Our horses bolted, and it was all I could do to hang on as we raced back towards the ranch house. Behind us, I could hear the creature pursuing, its eerie howl echoing across the desert. Duncan was shouting something, but the wind whipped his words away before they could reach me. As we approached the ranch house, Duncan suddenly veered off towards an old barn I'd never paid much attention to before. He dismounted quickly, gesturing for me to do the same. "Inside!" he yelled. "Quickly!" I followed him into the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. Duncan rushed to a back corner where he began moving aside bales of hay to reveal a trapdoor. "Down here," he said, pulling the door open. "It's our only chance." I didn't hesitate, descending the ladder into darkness. Duncan followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind us. In the pitch black, I heard him fumbling with something, and then a soft glow filled the space as he lit an old oil lamp. We were in a small, circular room, its walls covered in strange symbols and paintings. In the center stood a pedestal holding a bundle of herbs and feathers. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Duncan moved to the pedestal, his movements quick and purposeful. "A sanctuary," he replied, "built by my grandfather and his grandfather before him. A place of protection against the things that roam the night." Above us we could hear the skinwalker circling the barn, its claws scraping against the wood. Duncan began to chant in Navajo, his voice low and rhythmic. As he spoke, the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a faint light. The skinwalker's howls grew more frenzied, but they also seemed to be growing fainter, as if it was being driven away by some unseen force. Duncan's chanting continued, growing in intensity until, with a final ear-splitting shriek, the creature fell silent. We waited in tense silence for what felt like hours before Duncan finally stopped chanting. He turned to me, his face etched with exhaustion. "It's gone," he said. "For now." As we emerged from the hidden room, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The world seemed different somehow, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. Duncan placed a hand on my shoulder. "Now you understand," he said softly. "This isn't just a job. It's a calling. We're not just ranchers here. We're guardians." In the days and weeks that followed, Duncan began to teach me in earnest, not just about ranching, but about the old ways, the rituals and beliefs that had protected his people for generations. I learned about the delicate balance between our world and the spirit world, and the importance of maintaining that balance. As time passed, I found myself changing. The city boy who had arrived at the ranch months ago was gone, replaced by someone more attuned to the rhythms of the land and the whispers of the spirits. I began to see things more clearly, to sense the presence of the otherworldly beings that shared this land with us. There were more encounters over the years, of course. Not all as dramatic as that first night with the Skinwalker, but each one a reminder of the responsibility we bore. We faced spirits both benevolent and malevolent, always striving to maintain the balance. Duncan grew older, and I took on more of the responsibilities of running the ranch and protecting our territory. When he finally passed, it was with the knowledge that he had passed on his legacy, that the watch would continue. It was the autumn of 1985, and I'd settled into what I thought would be a peaceful retirement in a small town tucked away in the Rocky Mountains. After hanging up my badge at the Denver Police Department, I believed I'd left behind the chaos and danger of city life. The name's Harold McLean, though most folks around here just call me Harry. I'd swapped my gun for a fishing rod, spending my days by crystal-clear mountain lakes, relishing the tranquility I'd longed for during my years on the force. On a crisp afternoon in late September, I was cleaning my latest catch on the porch of my modest cabin when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel. Looking up, I saw Sheriff Tom Wilkes's patrol car pulling up. Tom was a good man, about a decade younger than me, with a nervous tic that only surfaced when something was really troubling him. As he stepped out of the car, I could see that tic working overtime. "Harry," he called out as he approached, "I need a favor." I set aside my fish and wiped my hands on a rag. "What's going on, Tom?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hat clutched in his hands. "Got a couple of hikers missing up near Shadow Pine Trail. They've been gone 3 days now. We're short-staffed, and I could use your expertise." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Shadow Pine Trail had a reputation, and not a good one. The local Native American tribe considered it sacred ground, warning outsiders to stay away. Legend spoke of shadows that moved on their own, and voices that lured people off the path. Even the most experienced hikers gave it a wide berth. "I thought that area was off limits," I replied, frowning. Tom nodded. "It is, but you know how some folks are. Think the rules don't apply to them." I sighed, feeling the old instincts stirring. Part of me wanted to say no, to stay in my comfortable retirement. But I knew I couldn't live with myself if something happened to those hikers, and I'd done nothing to help. "All right," I said finally. "I'll help. When do we head out?" Relief washed over Tom's face. "First light tomorrow. Meet me at the station." As Tom drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something bigger than a simple search and rescue. I spent the evening checking my old gear, making sure everything was in working order. As I packed, my mind wandered to the stories I'd heard about Shadow Pine Trail. Most of them I'd dismissed as superstition or campfire tales meant to scare tourists. But there was always a kernel of truth in such stories, wasn't there? The next morning I arrived at the sheriff's station just as the sun was peeking over the mountains. Tom was already there, along with Deputy Maria Rodriguez and a park ranger named Bill Hawkins. Maria was sharp-eyed and steady-handed, a rising star in the department. I'd worked with her a few times before and was glad to have her along. Bill was a different story. He knew the mountains better than anyone, having spent 2 decades roaming their slopes. But there was a wildness in his eyes that made me uneasy. We piled into Tom's SUV and headed out. The drive was mostly silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we neared the trailhead, Bill spoke up. "You all know the stories about this place, right?" he asked, his voice low. Maria rolled her eyes. "Come on, Bill, we don't need any ghost stories right now." But I caught Tom's eye in the rearview mirror. There was worry there, more than a missing persons case would usually warrant. We drove as far as the dirt roads allowed, then continued on foot. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight struggled to touch the ground. As we trekked deeper, An unsettling quiet enveloped us. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig. "Anyone else feeling the creeps?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just the woods playing tricks," Bill replied, though his clenched jaw said otherwise. About 5 miles in, we found the campsite of the missing hikers. 2 tents were pitched haphazardly, supplies scattered around as if in a hurry. A cold fire pit suggested they hadn't been there for at least a day. "Looks like they left in a hurry," Tom noted, crouching to examine the ashes. I picked up a discarded backpack, rifling through its contents. No signs of a struggle, but why would they leave without their gear? "Maybe they went for a short hike and got lost," Maria suggested, but even she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. Without taking water or jackets, doesn't add up. We decided to split up to cover more ground. Tom paired off with Bill while Maria came with me. We agreed to radio back every hour, no exceptions. As Maria and I headed northwest, following what seemed to be a faint trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After an hour of walking, the trees began to thin, and we entered a clearing. In the center stood a stone formation arranged in a circle. Strange symbols were etched into the rocks, unlike anything I'd seen before. "What do you make of this?" Maria asked, running her fingers over the carvings. "Could be Native American," I said, though I'd never seen symbols quite like these in my studies of local tribes. A rustling sound came from the tree line. We both turned, hands instinctively moving to our sidearms. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Hopefully the kind that doesn't bite," she replied with a nervous chuckle. We decided to head back to rendezvous with Tom and Bill. As we retraced our steps, the forest seemed different. Trees we'd passed before now looked unfamiliar, as if the landscape was shifting around us. "Are we going the right way?" Maria asked, a note of concern in her voice. I wanted to reassure her, but doubt was creeping in. "I thought so, but now I'm not sure." Our radios crackled to life, making us both jump. "This is Tom. Do you copy?" I grabbed my radio, relief washing over me. "We hear you, Tom. We're a bit turned around. What's your position?" There was a pause before Tom's voice came back, strained. "Same here. Bill's gone missing." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, missing?" "One minute he was behind me, the next he was just gone. No sound, no trace." Maria and I exchanged worried glances. "Stay where you are," I said into the radio. "We'll find you." We picked up the pace, but every path seemed to lead us back to the stone circle. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against us, herding us back to this eerie spot. "This is impossible," Maria said, frustration creeping into her voice. The radio crackled again, but this time it was just static, punctuated by faint whispers. We couldn't make out any words, just a sense of urgency and dread. "Tom, say again. You're breaking up." I spoke into the radio, but only silence answered. Night was approaching fast, and the idea of being stuck out here after dark didn't sit well with me. "Let's set up camp," I suggested. "We'll try again at first light." Reluctantly, Maria agreed. We built a small fire, its warmth doing little to ease the tension that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. "Do you believe those legends about this place?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I hesitated before answering. I'm not one for ghost stories, but something's not right here. I've been in these woods 100 times, and I've never felt anything like this. As the flames flickered, I thought I saw shadows moving between the trees. Probably just the fire playing tricks, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, a distant scream shattered the silence. Maria and I jumped to our feet, weapons drawn. "That sounded like Tom," she said, her face pale in the firelight. We grabbed our gear and headed toward the sound, leaving the relative safety of our campfire behind. The darkness was thick, our flashlights barely piercing it. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon another clearing. In the center lay Bill, face pale and eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Deep scratches crisscrossed his body, his clothes torn and bloody. Maria covered her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Oh my God." I knelt beside him, checking for a pulse even though I knew it was futile. "He's gone." Our radios remained stubbornly silent. No word from Tom. "We need to get out of here," Maria said, panic edging her voice. I nodded but hesitated. "Agreed, but we can't leave Tom." A rustling came from behind us. We spun around, weapons raised. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Tom, but something was off. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Tom, you okay?" I asked, though every instinct was screaming that this wasn't Tom. Not anymore. He lifted his head, revealing eyes that weren't his. They were black, empty pools that seemed to swallow the light. "Join us," he whispered, his voice a raspy approximation of Tom's familiar drawl. Before we could react, he lunged at Maria, knocking her to the ground. I pulled him off and we struggled. His strength was overwhelming, far beyond what Tom should have been capable of. "Snap out of it, Tom!" I shouted, but there was no recognition in those black eyes. With no other choice, I struck him on the head with the butt of my pistol. He collapsed unconscious. Maria got to her feet, shaking. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my mind reeling. "But we need to move. Now!" We tied Tom's hands just in case and carried him between us. Navigating in the dark was risky, but staying put felt worse. As dawn broke, we finally reached the edge of the forest. Relief washed over me until I realized Tom was no longer with us. "How is that possible?" Maria exclaimed, looking around wildly. "He was right here." We searched the area, but found no trace of Tom or the ropes we'd used to bind him. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Back in town, we alerted the authorities. Search parties were dispatched, but neither Tom nor any sign of the missing hikers were ever found. The official report listed the disappearances as unresolved, citing treacherous terrain and possible animal attacks. But I knew better. What we'd encountered in those woods was something beyond natural explanation. A week after we returned, I received a package at my doorstep. Inside was a VHS tape labeled with my name. With shaking hands, I hooked it up to my old player. The footage was shaky, showing the stone circle we'd found in the woods. Voices whispered in a language I didn't recognize, building to a fevered chant. Then the camera panned to show Tom standing among the stones, eyes black as night. He smiled, but it wasn't Tom's smile. It was something ancient and hungry. The screen went to static, and the tape ended. I handed the tape over to the new sheriff, but investigations led nowhere. The tape itself seemed to degrade every time it was played, until finally it was nothing but snow and static. I decided to leave that town soon after. The memories of what happened in those woods haunted me, turning my dreams into nightmares. I moved to a small coastal town, as far from the mountains as I could get, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear those whispers. And I wonder about Tom and those hikers, and what really lurks in the shadows of Shadow Pine Trail. Years have passed, and I've tried to put that experience behind me. But recently I've been hearing rumors, stories of other forests, other trails where people go missing, where the shadows move on their own and voices call in the night. And I can't help but wonder, is it spreading? Was what we encountered in those woods just the beginning of something larger? Something that's slowly seeping into our world? I don't have answers. But I know one thing for certain. There are places in this world where the veil between what we know and what we fear is thin. And sometimes, if we're not careful, that veil can tear. So if you find yourself on a lonely trail, and the shadows seem to move in ways they shouldn't, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't follow the voices into the dark. The wind always carried the smell of pine up here. It was sharp, clean, like it was reminding you that civilization was far, far away. I never liked the idea of a place where everyone knew everyone. It meant they'd know your business whether you wanted them to or not. But I had a job to do, and Sable Ridge wasn't going to investigate itself. "Detective Neil Ruddock," I said, shaking hands with the local sheriff, an older man named Lester Vance with deep-set eyes that seemed tired beyond his years. "You're a long way from the city, Detective," he said, a slight smirk on his face. "Seems that way," I replied, looking around at the quiet, isolated village. Nestled in the northern woods of Minnesota, Sable Ridge was the kind of place you'd miss on a map. A couple of roads in and out, a church, and a few stores. Hardly enough people to fill the diner where I was now sitting. "Tell me about the missing people." Lester sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's been happening for about 2 months now, 4 missing so far. First, a young woman, Annabelle Kane, went out for a hike and never came back. We found her backpack, but no sign of her. Then a couple of weeks later, old Joe Grady disappeared. He was out fishing, but all we found was his boat tied up by the shore." I nodded, pulling out my notebook. "And the others?" "Same story," Lester said grimly. "No signs of a struggle, no bodies. It's like they just vanished." "Any suspects? Foul play?" I asked. Lester hesitated, then leaned in a little closer. "This town's got history, Ruddock. It's got stories." "What kind of stories?" "Old stories, folklore, some say. But look, we're not superstitious folks. But people here talk. They say something's been out there in the woods, something ancient." I sat back in my chair, narrowing my eyes. "Are you suggesting this is some kind of creature?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Lester said flatly. "But the fact is 4 people are missing and we haven't found a damn trace." I took a deep breath. I didn't come all the way from Minneapolis to chase fairy tales. "I'll need to talk to the families. Start with the Kane girl." Lester gave a sharp nod. "I'll take you there." Annabelle's mother was a wreck. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her hands shook as she clutched a coffee cup. The house was small and neat, the kind of place where people took pride in keeping things in order, but nothing could mask the weight of grief. "She was always going out to hike," Mrs. Kane said, her voice shaky. "She loved the woods." "Did she mention anyone following her? Anything strange?" I asked. Mrs. Kane shook her head. "No, but she was scared the last couple of weeks before she disappeared." "Scared of what?" "She didn't say, just that she felt like something was watching her, something she couldn't see." I scribbled down the notes, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "Did she say anything else?" "She had dreams, bad ones. Said she saw a man out in the woods watching her, but when she'd wake up she couldn't remember his face." "Did she describe him at all?" "Just that he was tall, thin, but she said it didn't feel like a man, not really." I stood up and thanked her for her time. As I left the house, Lester was waiting by his patrol car, chewing on a toothpick. "You get anything?" he asked. "Just more questions," I said, closing my notebook. "What about the Grady case?" Lester nodded. "His wife's still around, lives on the other side of town. I'll take you over." The Grady house sat on the edge of the forest, an old cabin with a sagging roof and chipped paint. Mrs. Grady was tougher than Mrs. Kane, but I could see the same haunted look in her eyes. "He'd gone fishing, that's all," she said, her voice thick. "He always went fishing in the mornings, came back by noon. But that day he didn't come back." "Did you notice anything strange in the days leading up to his disappearance?" I asked. "He didn't talk much," she said, "but he had this look, like he knew something was coming. He didn't say what, but Joe wasn't a man who scared easy." "And he never mentioned seeing anyone out in the woods or anything unusual?" Mrs. Grady hesitated, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. "He said he heard something at night, said it sounded like howling, but not like any animal he'd ever heard." "Howling?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. She nodded slowly. "It's hard to explain. It was like like it was trying to be human. I leaned back in my chair, glancing over at Lester, who gave me a grim look. "You hear anything about this, Sheriff?" "Just rumors," he said, crossing his arms, "but nobody's ever seen it, just heard it." Later that evening, I found myself walking along the edge of the woods where Annabelle had last been seen. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees. The air was cold, biting, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. I'd been doing this job long enough to know that when people start disappearing without a trace, there's usually a logical explanation. But something about Sable Ridge felt off. The silence was too thick, the woods too still. Suddenly, a rustle in the trees caught my attention. I stopped, hand instinctively going to the gun at my waist. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just shadows. But then I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the fading light. Tall, thin, watching. "Hey!" I called out, moving toward it. The figure didn't move. I quickened my pace, but as I got closer, the figure seemed to fade into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I stopped at the spot where it had stood. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of anyone. Just the wind whispering through the trees. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. It was getting late and I needed to regroup, but as I turned to head back toward the village, I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A howl, but it wasn't a wolf. It was low, almost like a human voice, distorted and unnatural. It sent a jolt of fear through me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of those old stories pressing down on me. By the time I got back to the village, it was dark. I headed straight for the diner where Lester was waiting with a pot of coffee. "See anything out there?" he asked, pouring me a cup. "Maybe," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. "You ever hear about a tall, thin man hanging around the woods?" Lester's hand froze for a second. Then he set the pot down. "You're not the first to see him," he said quietly. "What is it?" I asked. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "They call him the Hollow Man, some kind of local legend. Been around for generations, according to the old folks. They say he's not human, something else." "And you believe that?" Lester shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I believe. All I know is people have been disappearing and no one's ever found a body." I took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. "I'm not one for ghost stories, Sheriff, but whatever's out there, it's real and it's dangerous." That night I stayed at the local inn, but sleep didn't come easy. The wind howled outside and every creak of the old building made me jump. I kept thinking about that figure in the woods and the sound of that howl echoing in my ears. The next morning I was packing up to leave when there was a knock at my door. It was Lester, his face pale. "We found another one," he said. The body was discovered deep in the woods, torn apart in a way that no animal could have done. It was Grady, or what was left of him. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, and beside him, carved into a tree, was a symbol, a circle with a slash through it, ancient, crude. Lester stood beside me, his face pale. "It's him, isn't it?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We found proof of the Hollow Man that day, but it wasn't the kind of proof you could take back to the city. Some things are best left buried deep in the woods, where only the wind and the trees can hear them. The people of Sable Ridge didn't need to be told. They already knew. As the days wore on, the investigation deepened, and so did the mystery. I interviewed more locals, each story adding another layer to the legend of the Hollow Man. Some spoke of ancestors who had encountered him generations ago. Others whispered about rituals performed to keep him at bay. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I truly understood. One evening I found myself in the local library, poring over old town records and newspaper clippings. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, watched me with knowing eyes. "You won't find him in those books, Detective," she said softly, startling me. I looked up, meeting her gaze. What do you mean? She sat down across from me, her wrinkled hands clasped on the table. The Hollow Man isn't something you can understand with facts and figures. He's older than this town, older than the forests themselves. You've seen him? I asked, leaning forward. Margaret's eyes grew distant. Once, when I was a girl, I was out picking berries and I wandered too far into the woods. I saw him standing between the trees, tall and thin, like a shadow given form. But it was his eyes that I remember most. They were empty, like looking into a void. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened? I ran, she said simply, and I never went that deep into the woods again. No one who sees him up close ever does. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. But what is he? What does he want? Margaret shook her head slowly. Some say he's a spirit of the forest. Others say he's something that was here long before us. As for what he wants, he takes people, Detective. He's always taken people. It's just that sometimes years can go by between disappearances. We almost forget. Almost. I left the library that night with more questions than answers. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. The next day, I decided to venture deeper into the woods. Lester tried to talk me out of it, but I was determined. I needed to see for myself, to find some concrete evidence that could explain what was happening. The forest was dense, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight. The further I went, the more oppressive the silence became. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. Hours passed, and I found myself in a clearing I didn't recognize. The trees here seemed older, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. And there, carved into several of them, was that same symbol, the circle with a slash. As I examined one of the carvings, I heard it. That same unnatural howl, closer this time. I spun around, drawing my gun. But there was nothing there. Just shadows and trees. But then I saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing, a figure so tall and thin it seemed to defy natural proportions. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over an impossibly gaunt frame. And its face, where there should have been features, there was only a smooth, blank expanse. I tried to speak, to demand it identify itself, but no words came out. I was frozen, caught in the gaze of those empty, bottomless eyes. It took a step forward, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee back to the safety of the town. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, helpless as the Hollow Man approached. Just as it was about to reach me, a gunshot rang out. The figure disappeared in an instant, melting into the shadows between the trees. I turned to see Lester standing there, his rifle still raised. "I told you not to come out here alone," he said, his voice shaky. We made our way back to town in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we were safely in his office, a bottle of whiskey between us, that Lester finally spoke. "What do we do now?" he asked. I took a long drink, trying to steady my nerves. "I don't know," I admitted. This is beyond anything I've ever dealt with." Lester nodded grimly. "Welcome to Sable Ridge, Detective." Over the next few weeks, we tried everything we could think of. We set up cameras in the woods, organized search parties, even brought in a team of paranormal investigators. But the Hollow Man remained elusive. The cameras would malfunction, the search parties would get turned around and lose their way, and the paranormal team left after just 2 days, refusing to explain what they'd experienced. More disappearances followed. A teenage boy vanished while walking home from a friend's house. An elderly woman went missing from her own backyard. Each time we'd find that symbol carved nearby. a mocking reminder of our helplessness. The town was gripped by fear. People refused to go out after dark. The woods, once a source of beauty and pride for Sable Ridge, became a no-man's land that no one dared enter. I stayed on, unable to leave while the case remained unsolved. But with each passing day, I felt my grip on reality slipping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard that inhuman howl just outside my window. I'd catch glimpses of a tall, thin figure out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself at the edge of the woods again. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the trees. And there, standing just beyond the tree line, was the Hollow Man. This time I didn't run. I didn't reach for my gun. I just stood there, staring into those empty eyes. And for the first time, I heard it speak. Not with words, but with a voice that seemed to echo inside my head. It spoke of ancient things, of a time before humans walked the earth. It spoke of hunger, of a need that could never be satisfied. And it spoke of me, of how it had been waiting for someone like me to come to Sable Ridge. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in that otherworldly voice. When I finally came back to myself, the sun was rising, and I was alone at the edge of the forest. I went back to my room at the inn and packed my bags. I left a note for Lester, explaining that I had to leave, that I couldn't stay in Sable Ridge any longer. I didn't tell him about my encounter with the Hollow Man, or about the things it had shown me. Some truths are too heavy to share. As I drove out of town, I caught one last glimpse of the forest in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a tall, thin figure standing among the trees, watching me go. But then I blinked, and it was gone. I never returned to Sable Ridge. I left law enforcement soon after, unable to reconcile what I'd experienced with the world I thought I knew. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that haunting howl in my dreams. And I wonder about the people of Sable Ridge, about Lester and Margaret and all the others. I wonder if they're still there, living in the shadow of the woods, keeping their secrets. And I wonder about the Hollow Man. Is he still there, walking silently between the trees? Is he waiting for the next outsider to stumble into his domain? Or has he moved on, seeking new hunting grounds in other forgotten corners of the world? I don't have answers to these questions, and perhaps it's better that way. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some truths too dangerous to be known. Years have passed since I left Sable Ridge, but the memories of that place still haunt me. I've tried to move on, to build a new life far from the shadows of those ancient woods. I took a job as a private investigator in a bustling city, thinking the noise and the crowds would drown out the echoes of the past. But even here, surrounded by steel and concrete, I can't escape the feeling that something followed me from those dark forests. It started small. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard that unearthly howl echoing between the buildings. I'd catch glimpses of impossibly tall, thin figures in crowded streets, only to blink and find them gone. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering effects of trauma. But as time went on, the incidents became more frequent, more vivid. One night I was working late in my office, poring over files for a routine infidelity case. The city outside was quiet, most of its inhabitants long since gone to bed. As I reached for my coffee cup, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving across my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned to look directly at the window. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, pressing against the glass, I saw a face, if you could call it that. A smooth, featureless expanse where features should have been, set atop an impossibly elongated neck. Those empty eyes, black as the void, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair in my haste to get away. By the time I regained my composure and looked again, the face was gone. But on the window, traced in the condensation as if by a ghostly finger, was that familiar symbol, a circle with a slash through it. That was when I knew. The Hollow Man hadn't stayed in Sable Ridge. It had followed me, stalking me across the miles and years, and now it had found me again. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light combined with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Hollow Man was here, in my city, and I was powerless to stop it. I threw myself into research, spending countless hours in libraries and online forums, searching for any information about similar entities in other parts of the world. I found scattered accounts, legends of the Slender Man, stories of the Rake, tales of shadowy figures stalking the edges of human civilization. But none of them quite matched what I had seen in Sable Ridge, what I was seeing now in the city. As my obsession grew, my work began to suffer. Clients complained about missed deadlines and sloppy investigations. My few friends started to distance themselves, put off by my increasingly erratic behavior. But I couldn't stop. I knew that somewhere in the vast tapestry of human knowledge and folklore, there had to be answers. We made our way back to the park's main office, the events of the past day weighing heavily on us. Rachel's body was taken to the morgue, and the skeletal remains were sent for further analysis. I handed the stone over to our forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. As I sat down to write up my preliminary report, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just scratching the surface of something much bigger. The forest had given up 2 of its secrets, but I had a sinking feeling there were many more to uncover. Little did I know, this case was about to take me down a rabbit hole of ancient mysteries and unspeakable horrors. The Great Smoky Mountains held secrets that defied explanation, and I was about to come face to face with something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. Days turned into weeks, and the case only grew stranger. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death for Rachel. Her body showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of drug use, nothing to explain why a healthy 28-year-old woman would suddenly drop dead in the middle of the forest. The skeletal remains were identified as belonging to a hiker who had gone missing over a decade ago. His case had gone cold, written off as another unfortunate soul lost to the wilderness. But now, finding him in the same spot as Rachel, it seemed like too much of a coincidence. And then there was the stone. Our forensics team couldn't make heads or tails of it. It wasn't from any local geology, and the markings didn't match any known language or symbols. It was as if it had appeared out of thin air, just like our victims had vanished. I spent countless hours poring over old case files, looking for any connections. And then I found it. A series of disappearances dating back decades, all in the same area of the park. All unsolved, all with no trace of the missing persons ever found. One night, as I was going over the files for what felt like the 100th time, my phone rang. It was Lisa, one of the rangers who had been with me when we found Rachel. "Otis," her voice was shaky, "you need to come to the park, now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my coat and drove out to the park, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Lisa was waiting for me, her face pale in the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just follow me," she said, leading me into the woods. We walked in silence, the darkness pressing in around us. The familiar hum I'd heard that first night seemed to grow louder with each step. Lisa led me to the same clearing where we'd found Rachel. In the center was another circle of stones, and in the middle, another body. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The body was that of a man, his face contorted in a look of sheer terror. He was dressed in hiking gear, and from the looks of it, he hadn't been dead long. "We found him this morning," Lisa said quietly. "No ID, no belongings, just dead." I knelt beside the body, examining it closely. There were no visible injuries, just like Rachel. But this time there was something different. In the man's hand was a piece of paper, tightly clenched. I pried it loose, my hands trembling. The paper was old and worn, but the writing was clear. It was a map with the clearing marked in red, and beneath it a single word: beware. I stood up, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the trees and the silence. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We made our way back to the main office, the weight of the new discovery heavy on our shoulders. I handed the map over to the forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The new body was identified as another missing hiker, his case also long cold. The map was examined, but it didn't match any known trails or landmarks. It was as if it was drawn by someone who knew the forest intimately, but not in any official capacity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, something ancient and malevolent. The stone, the bodies, the map, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. It was during a late-night research session that I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old journal buried deep in the park's archives, written by one of the original surveyors of the area in the late 1800s. The journal spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, unexplained disappearances, eerie sounds, and most disturbingly, a clearing with a circle of stones that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The surveyor wrote of a local Cherokee legend about a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where dark spirits could cross over and take the unwary. The description matched our clearing perfectly. I knew then that we were dealing with something beyond the realm of normal police work, but I also knew that I couldn't just walk away. Too many people had vanished, too many families were left without answers. I gathered a team of trusted colleagues, including Ted and Lisa, and we set out for the clearing once more. This time we were prepared, or so we thought. We had cameras, recording equipment, and enough supplies to last days. As we entered the clearing, the air grew heavy with tension. We set up our equipment, documenting everything meticulously. Hours passed and nothing happened. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. And then, just as the sun began to set, we heard it. The low hum, growing louder and more insistent. We looked around, but there was nothing, just the trees and the darkness closing in. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The stones in the circle glowed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows on the trees. And then, in the center of the circle, a figure appeared. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved with an eerie grace, its limbs long and thin. It looked at us and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and the ground beneath us began to crack. We stumbled back, trying to keep our footing. "Otis, what do we do?" Lisa shouted, her voice filled with fear. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing her arm. We ran, the ground cracking and shaking beneath us. The hum grew louder, almost deafening. I glanced back and saw the figure watching us, its eyes glowing brighter. We burst out of the clearing and into the forest, the ground still trembling. We didn't stop running until we reached the main office, our hearts pounding and our minds reeling. We reported everything, but no one believed us. The footage we recorded was mysteriously corrupted. The maps we found were dismissed as hoaxes. It was as if the forest itself was hiding the truth. Rachel's case remained unsolved, her death a mystery. The old remains and the new body were buried, their stories forgotten. But I knew there was something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent. In the months that followed, I tried to move on, to focus on other cases. But the events of that day haunted me. The forest had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. I still have the stone, a small, smooth reminder of the unknown. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low, insistent hum echoing through the silence. The Great Smoky Mountains keep their secrets well. But for those who know where to look, the signs are there. A warning to the curious, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. As for me, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that there are things in this world that defy explanation. But I can't help but wonder, as I look out at the distant mountains, how many more souls the forest will claim before its hunger is satisfied. The crisp autumn air bit at my exposed skin as I stepped out of my SUV, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway leading up to my father's old cabin. Well, my cabin now. The thought still felt strange, even after all these years. I'm Valadin, 25 years old, and this piece of land nestled in the Kentucky wilderness has been my sanctuary since my father passed away 6 years ago. As I shouldered my heavy backpack and grabbed my rifle case, memories flooded back. I could almost hear my father's gruff voice, his thick Russian accent softened by years in America but never quite gone. "Always be prepared, Valadin," he'd say. "Nature is beautiful, but she can be cruel." I smiled wryly at the memory. My father had been many things: a former VDV soldier, a stern parent, and above all, a survivor. He'd brought me to America when I was just 10, leaving behind the cold streets of Vladivostok and my mother, who chose to stay behind when they divorced. It wasn't an easy transition, but my father was determined to give me a better life. The cabin loomed before me, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs that had weathered countless storms. It wasn't much to look at, but it was home. More than that, it was a testament to my father's strength and the legacy he left behind. As I approached the porch, I noticed the worn Soviet flag still hanging by the door, faded but proud. My father might have left Russia, but Russia never quite left him. I ran my fingers over the familiar fabric before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The interior was just as I remembered it, Spartan but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves lined with books on survival, military history, and Russian literature. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of old wood and memories. I set about opening windows and airing out the place. As I moved around the cabin, my eyes fell on the framed photos on the mantel. There was one of my father in his VDV uniform, looking young and fierce. Next to it, a picture of the two of us on my high school graduation day. His proud smile belied the pain he must have been feeling. We'd learned about his cancer diagnosis just a week before. Shaking off the melancholy, I focused on the task at hand. I was here to prepare for a camping trip with my old friend James. We'd drifted apart after high school, but he'd reached out recently, asking if I wanted to go camping. It seemed like a good opportunity to reconnect. I began unpacking my gear clothes, including my father's old VDV uniform, a cherished memento, MREs, and of course my rifle and ammunition. Some might think 500 rounds excessive for a camping trip, but my father's voice echoed in my head. Better to have and not need than to need and not have. As I arranged my supplies, my mind wandered back to the day my father and I first arrived in Kentucky. It was a warm summer day, so different from the bitter cold of Vladivostok. I remember feeling overwhelmed by the lush green landscape, so unlike the industrial gray of my hometown. My father had squeezed my shoulder and said, "This is our new beginning, Valadin. We make it what we want." Those first few months were tough. My broken English made me an easy target for bullies at school, and my father struggled to find work that matched his skills. But we persevered. My father took odd jobs during the day and spent his evenings teaching me English and the survival skills he'd learned in the military. It was during one of these lessons that he first brought me to this cabin. He'd won it in a poker game, he said, though I always suspected there was more to that story. The place was run down then, barely more than a shack. But over the years we rebuilt it together, turning it into a sanctuary from the world. As the sun began to set, I lit a fire in the hearth and settled in with a bottle of vodka, another habit inherited from my father. The familiar burn in my throat was comforting as I leaned back in the old armchair, lost in thought. My mind wandered to James and our upcoming trip. I'd invited my friend Grisha along too, not wanting to feel like a third wheel with James and his new girlfriend. Unfortunately, Grisha couldn't make it due to work commitments. It would just be the three of us then. Grisha was one of the few friends who stuck by me in those early days. He was a fellow outsider, the son of Ukrainian immigrants, who understood what it was like to straddle two worlds. We bonded over our shared experiences and our love for the outdoors. Many weekends were spent in these woods, learning to track animals, build shelters, and start fires without matches. As the vodka worked its magic, my eyelids grew heavy. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a sound outside. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled for my watch. To my shock, I'd slept for nearly a day. Cursing under my breath, I stumbled to the kitchen to brew some much-needed coffee. As the rich aroma filled the cabin, I heard the distinct sound of tires on gravel. James must be here. Still nursing my hangover, I grabbed my rifle out of habit and peered out the window. A beat-up Dodge Ram was making its way up the driveway, country music blaring loud enough to wake the dead. I relaxed, recognizing James behind the wheel. But as the truck drew closer, my blood ran cold. Sitting in the passenger seat wasn't some stranger. It was Alicia, my ex-girlfriend. My stomach churned, and it wasn't just the hangover. Alicia and I had broken up less than 3 months ago, and the wounds were still fresh. What the hell was James thinking, bringing her here? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe this was a chance to clear the air, to move past the bitterness of our breakup. But as I watched them climb out of the truck, Alicia's face set in a scowl. I knew this weekend was going to be anything but relaxing. They entered the cabin, and an uncomfortable silence fell over us. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. James, oblivious to the undercurrents, grinned and said, "Man, you guys are pretty awkward. Have you met before?" I felt a surge of anger at his cluelessness. "Ask her," I spat out, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Alicia's face contorted with rage. "Listen, you Euro trash," she hissed. "You're the one who said I could come. We don't need your crap to start." James, finally catching on that something was amiss, asked Alicia to calm down. They stepped outside, and I could hear the low murmur of their voices as she presumably filled him in on our history. As I waited, my mind raced back to the day Alicia and I broke up. We'd been together for almost a year, and I thought things were going well. But then I caught her texting her ex, making plans to meet up behind my back. When I confronted her, she turned it around on me, accusing me of being paranoid and controlling. The argument that followed was ugly, full of shouted accusations and bitter words. In the end, she stormed out, leaving me with a shattered heart and a deep sense of betrayal. When James returned, his face was a mask of fury. Without warning, he slapped me hard across the face. "Why did you cheat on her?" he demanded. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't cheated. It was the other way around. The injustice of it all, coupled with the stinging pain in my cheek, pushed me over the edge. With a roar of anger, I lunged at James, my fist connecting solidly with his jaw. In one fluid motion, I pinned him against the wall, my forearm pressed against his throat. "What's your problem?" I growled, my face inches from his. James spat in my face, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Let me go," he choked out. I was about to retort when a scream from outside pierced the air. Alicia burst through the door, her face pale with terror. "I saw someone outside," she gasped. I released James, who slumped against the wall, gasping for breath. We both turned to Alicia, our argument momentarily forgotten. "What do you mean you saw someone?" James asked, rubbing his throat. Alicia's voice trembled as she spoke. "I saw a big man in the woods. He looked like he was wearing a goat mask." My first instinct was disbelief. This was my family's land, isolated and miles from the nearest neighbor. The idea of some psycho-hillbilly satanic cultist lurking in the woods seemed absurd. But the fear in Alicia's eyes was real. "This is my family land," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's no one around for miles. The closest neighbor is 5 miles away." Alicia's fear quickly turned to anger. "You arsehole," she spat. "If you don't go look, I'm going to call the cops and say you hit me." The threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I knew she was capable of following through, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with the police. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my father's old rifle. As I moved towards the door, I turned to James. "You really just going to sit here and let her do this?" I asked, disappointment clear in my voice. "You're some kind of friend." The night air was cool on my skin as I stepped outside. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. I loaded a 30-round magazine into my rifle and said a silent prayer to St. Michael, just as my father had taught me. I moved cautiously towards the back of the cabin, my rifle held at the ready. The forest loomed dark and imposing before me. A twig snapped somewhere in the shadows, and I swung my rifle towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stood there, scanning the tree line, memories of my childhood in these woods flooded back. I remembered my father teaching me to move silently through the underbrush, to read the signs left by animals, to navigate by the stars. He always said that the forest was alive, that it had its own spirit and will. "Respect it," he'd say, "and it will protect you. Disrespect it, and it will swallow you whole." Suddenly I heard the cabin door slam shut behind me, followed by the sound of car doors and an engine roaring to life. James's truck peeled out of the driveway, his voice carried on the wind. "Screw you and your communist dad." I stood there, stunned by their sudden departure. But before I could process what had happened, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was James's voice again, but wrong. It sounded like an animal trying to form words, repeating what James had just said. Then I smelled it, that sickly sweet odor of rotten eggs that I'd noticed earlier. My father's training kicked in, and I began shouting in Russian, hoping to intimidate whatever was out there. That's when I saw them, a pair of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They were at least 8 feet off the ground, far too high to belong to any normal animal. A primal fear gripped me, but I pushed it down, channeling it into anger instead. Without thinking, I emptied my entire magazine into the darkness where I'd seen the eyes. The forest erupted with the sound of gunfire, and I could hear something large crashing through the underbrush. As soon as the last shot rang out, I slammed a fresh magazine into the rifle and began backing towards the cabin. Once inside, I threw the heavy bar across the door and collapsed into a chair, my heart racing. For hours, I sat there in the darkness listening. I could hear it outside, still mimicking voices. Mine, James's, Alicia's, repeating snippets of our conversation from earlier. As the night wore on, my mind raced with possibilities. What had I seen out there? Was it some kind of animal or something else? I thought back to the stories my father used to tell, tales from his homeland of creatures that lurked in the dark places of the world. At the time, I dismissed them as fairy tales meant to scare children into behaving. Now I wasn't so sure. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I fell into a fitful sleep. My dreams were a chaotic mix of memories and nightmares. I saw my father, young and strong in his VDV uniform, fighting shadows that moved like smoke. I saw Alicia, her face twisted into an inhuman snarl, chasing me through endless woods. And always, there were those glowing yellow eyes watching from the darkness. When I awoke, the sun was streaming through the windows. and the woods were silent save for the normal sounds of birds and small animals. I quickly packed my things, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. As I drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The woods that had once been a sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. I never heard from James or Alicia again after that night. Part of me was glad for that, but another part wondered if they had encountered something on their drive home, something that might explain their sudden departure. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear, driven to unusual behavior by hunger or disease. Maybe the stress and alcohol had caused me to hallucinate. But deep down, I knew these explanations rang hollow. I threw myself into research, poring over local legends and folklore. I discovered stories of strange creatures in these hills, passed down through generations of settlers and Native Americans alike. Tales of shapeshifters, of spirits that could mimic human voices, of things that lurked at the edges of firelight, waiting for the unwary. The more I learned, the more I began to see connections. The rotten egg smell sulfur associated with demonic presence in many cultures. The ability to mimic voices, a trait ascribed to skinwalkers in Navajo legend. The glowing eyes, a common feature in stories of supernatural beasts across the world. But knowledge brought little comfort. If anything, it only deepened the sense of unease that had taken root in my soul. The world suddenly seemed larger, darker, full of hidden dangers I'd never considered before. In the years since, I've returned to the cabin many times. I've never seen anything like what I saw that night, but I can never quite shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear voices in the trees, familiar voices saying things I'd rather forget. Each time I visit, I find myself drawn deeper into the woods, searching for something. Answers, perhaps. Or maybe I'm looking for that thing, hoping to confront it, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But the forest keeps its secrets well, and I always return empty-handed. My father always said that nature could be cruel, but he never mentioned that it could be cunning too. Whatever is out there in those woods, it's patient, and I can't help but feel that one day it will be waiting for me again. As I sit here now writing this down, I can't help but wonder, was it all real? Or was it just the product of too much vodka, old resentments, and the wild imagination that comes with isolation? Part of me hopes it was all in my head, but a larger part, the part that remembers those glowing eyes and that horrible, mocking voice, knows better. The woods are quiet now, but I know better than to trust the silence. Whatever is out there, it's waiting, and one day, I fear, it will make itself known again. Until then, I'll keep my rifle close and my senses sharp. After all, that's what my father would have done. And in these woods, on this land that bridges my past and my present, being my father's son is the only thing that keeps the shadows at bay. But there's something else, something I haven't told anyone. Sometimes in the dead of night, when the moon is high and the woods are at their quietest, I hear it. A whisper barely audible calling my name. It sounds like my father's voice, but wrong, distorted, as if something is wearing his voice like an ill-fitting suit. The first time I heard it, I was certain I was dreaming. I jolted awake, sweat-soaked and trembling, to find the cabin bathed in silvery moonlight. The whisper came again from just outside my window. "Valadin," it said in that not-quite-right version of my father's voice. "Come out, boy. I have so much to show you." I lay there, frozen in terror, until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. No footprints in the dewy grass, no sign that anything had been prowling around the cabin in the night. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a product of stress and unresolved grief over my father's death. But it happened again, and again. Each time the voice grew a little clearer, a little more insistent, and each time I felt a pull, an almost irresistible urge to step outside and follow it into the depths of the forest. It was after one of these nights that I decided to dig deeper into my father's past. I knew he had been in the VDV, the Russian Airborne Forces, but he rarely spoke about his time in the service. Now, driven by a mix of curiosity and growing unease, I began to pore over the few documents and mementos he'd left behind. Most of it was what I expected. Commendations, photographs of young soldiers with serious faces, technical manuals for various weapons and equipment. But tucked away in the bottom of an old footlocker, I found something else. A journal, its pages yellow with age, filled with my father's cramped Cyrillic handwriting. My Russian was rusty, but as I deciphered the entries, a chill ran down my spine. My father wrote of a mission gone wrong in the remote Siberian wilderness. His unit had been dispatched to investigate reports of strange lights and unexplained disappearances in a small village near the Tunguska River. What they found there defied explanation. The village was empty but not abandoned. Meals sat half-eaten on tables, clothes hung to dry on lines, but there wasn't a single person to be found. And in the surrounding forest, they encountered something. My father's descriptions were vague, as if he struggled to put into words what he had seen, but a few details stood out. Yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, the stench of rotting eggs, and voices that mimicked the missing villagers, calling out from the woods. The mission ended in disaster. Of the 12 men who entered that forest, only my father and 2 others made it out alive. The official report blamed it on a combination of harsh conditions, equipment failure, and unspecified hostile forces. But my father's journal told a different story. He believed they had encountered something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting in those woods for centuries. And worse, he feared that by entering its domain, they had somehow drawn its attention to the outside world. The final entry in the journal was dated just a week before we left for America. In it, my father wrote of strange dreams, of feeling watched even in the heart of Vladivostok. He said he had to leave, to get as far away as possible, and he hoped that by crossing the ocean, he could leave whatever it was behind. Now, as I sit in this cabin my father and I built together, I can't help but wonder, did it follow him? Did it follow us? Is that what's out there in these Kentucky woods, calling to me with my father's voice? The rational part of my mind says it's impossible. The thing my father described, if it ever existed at all, is half a world away. But another part of me, the part that remembers those glowing eyes in the forest and that horrible mimicking voice, isn't so sure. I've thought about leaving, about selling the cabin and moving somewhere far away, somewhere with no forests or dark places for things to hide. But I can't. This land, this cabin, it's all I have left of my father. And more than that, I feel a responsibility. If there is something out there, something that followed us across the world, then I'm the only one who knows about it, the only one who might be able to stop it if it ever decides to do more than whisper from the shadows. So I stay. I maintain the cabin, I hike the trails, and I keep watch. I've installed motion-activated cameras around the property, though they've yet to capture anything unusual. I've reached out to some of the old-timers in the area, trying to gather local legends and stories that might shed some light on what I experienced. Most dismiss me as an outsider with an overactive imagination, but a few have shared tales that make me think I'm not the first to encounter strangeness in these woods. There's old man Pritchard, who lives about 10 miles down the road. He told me about the time, back in the 70s, when a whole family disappeared from a cabin not far from here. The police investigation turned up nothing, but Pritchard swears he saw lights moving through the woods that night, lights that seemed to whisper as they passed. Then there's Maria Running Deer, a Cherokee elder I met at a local market. When I hesitantly asked her about legends of shapeshifters or mimics in the area, her eyes widened. She told me of an old story passed down through her family, of a time long ago when her ancestors fought a war against creatures that could steal voices and wear skins like clothes. The battle was won, she said, but at a great cost. The few creatures that survived were sealed away in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. But seals can break, she warned me, her aged hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. And hungry things don't forget. These stories, combined with my father's journal and my own experiences, have led me to a chilling conclusion. Whatever is out there, it's old, ancient, and it's patient. It might wait years, decades, even centuries between appearances, but it never truly goes away. So I've made it my mission to learn everything I can. I've filled notebooks with research on folklore, cryptozoology, and the occult. I've trained myself in tracking and wilderness survival beyond even what my father taught me. And I've prepared the cabin, turning it into a fortress against the darkness. Salt lines at every threshold, iron nails in the door frames, protective symbols from a dozen different cultures carved discreetly into the logs. Some might call me paranoid. Hell, some days I wonder if I'm losing my mind. But then I remember the terror of that night, the inhuman yellow eyes, and the voice that was mine but not mine. And I know that no matter how long it takes, I have to be ready. Because one day, I'm sure of it, the whispers will become shouts, the shadows will take form, and whatever has been waiting out there in the woods will finally show itself. When that day comes, I'll be ready. I am my father's son, after all. And if there's one thing he taught me, it's that you never back down from a fight, no matter how terrifying the enemy might be. So I wait, and I watch, and I listen to the whispers in the woods, and I pray that when the time comes, I'll be strong enough to face what's out there. Because if I'm not, I fear it won't just be me who pays the price. Whatever this thing is, it's been patient for a long time. And I shudder to think what might happen if it ever decides it's done waiting. As the sun sets on another day, casting long shadows across the clearing, I finish writing this account. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to put it all down on paper. Maybe it's a warning, in case something happens to me. Maybe it's a call for help, a message in a bottle cast into the sea of time. Or maybe it's just my way of trying to make sense of the insensible, to bring some order to the chaos that has become my life. Whatever the reason, it's done now. The story is told, as best as I can tell it. And as I sit here on the porch, watching the darkness creep in from the tree line, I find myself straining my ears, listening for that familiar yet alien whisper. The woods are silent for now, but in this silence, I know a truth that both terrifies and strengthens me. The night is long, the forest is vast, and somewhere out there in the darkness something is waiting and watching, and one day calling my name. The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to creep through the curtains when I was jolted awake by an unfamiliar sound. My loyal companion, a German shepherd I'd raised from a pup, lay curled against me, his head resting on my shoulder as it always did. But something was different this morning. The dog's body was tense, rigid with alertness, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from deep in his chest. I blinked away the lingering fog of sleep, my mind struggling to process the situation. The digital clock on my nightstand read 5:27 a.m., far too early for either of us to be awake, especially on a Saturday. I reached out to stroke the dog's fur, hoping to soothe whatever had agitated him. "Hey, buddy," I murmured, my voice thick with sleep. "What's got you all worked up?" My words seemed to have the opposite effect. Instead of calming down, the dog's growl intensified, transforming into a series of sharp, aggressive barks. His eyes were fixed on the window, his ears pressed flat against his skull. I'd never seen him like this before, not even during his most heated confrontations with other dogs in the neighborhood. A chill ran down my spine as I followed his gaze. The curtains were partially open, offering a view of the sprawling yard that separated our house from our nearest neighbors. In the pre-dawn light, the familiar landscape took on an eerie quality, shadows stretching and distorting the shapes of trees and bushes. For a moment I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the same view I'd woken up to countless times before. But then, something moved. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a trick of the light, perhaps, or a remnant of a dream still clinging to my consciousness. But as I squinted, focusing intently on the yard, I saw it again, and this time there was no mistaking what I was seeing. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, was moving across the yard with inhuman speed. Its gait was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, arms swinging wildly as it covered an impossible amount of ground in mere seconds. The skin, visible even in the dim light, was an unnatural shade of gray, almost metallic in its sheen. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I blinked hard, certain that when I opened my eyes again, the figure would be gone. But it wasn't. It was still there, moving with that bizarre, loping gait, covering the 60 or 70 yards between our property line and the neighbors, in what seemed like 3 impossibly long strides. As it passed directly in front of my window, I caught a glimpse of its face, long and elongated, with features that seemed both familiar and utterly alien at the same time. Its arms, I noticed with a spike of terror, hung almost to its knees, swinging like pendulums as it ran. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. For several long moments I sat frozen in my bed, my hand buried in the dog's fur, my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. The dog's barks had subsided to low whimpers, but his body remained tense, alert. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. It couldn't be real, could it? Perhaps I was still dreaming, trapped in some hyper-realistic nightmare, but the warmth of the dog against my side, the cool morning air on my face, it all felt too real to be a dream. With a sudden burst of energy born of fear and adrenaline, I leaped out of bed. My legs felt weak, shaky, but I forced myself to move. I had to tell someone, had to make sure I wasn't going crazy. I burst into my father's room without knocking, my abrupt entrance startling him awake. He sat up quickly, years of ingrained protective instincts overriding his confusion at being woken so suddenly. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice alert despite having been asleep moments before. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, my description of what I'd seen sounding increasingly unbelievable even to my own ears. But to his credit, my father listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "We need to check it out," he said finally, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Whatever it was, we can't just ignore it." I nodded, grateful for his calm demeanor and practical approach. As we quickly dressed and made our way downstairs, my father retrieved 2 handguns from the safe in his study. The weight of the weapon in my hand was both reassuring and terrifying, a tangible reminder of the potential danger we might be facing. The dog followed close at our heels as we stepped out into the cool morning air. The sky was lightening now, the first true rays of sunlight beginning to peek over the horizon. In the growing light, our yard looked perfectly normal, peaceful even. Birds were beginning to stir, their cheerful songs a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. We moved cautiously across the lawn, our eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. The dog trotted ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. But as we reached the spot where I'd seen the creature pass, we found nothing. No footprints marred the dew-dampened grass. No broken branches or disturbed undergrowth marked the creature's passage. It was as if the thing I'd seen had never existed at all. "Are you sure about what you saw?" my father asked gently, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of concern and skepticism. I opened my mouth to respond, to insist that yes, I was absolutely certain. but the words died in my throat as I looked around at the perfectly ordinary scene before me. In the growing light of day, my experience seemed increasingly impossible, a product of an overactive imagination or perhaps a particularly vivid dream. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It seemed so real. My father nodded, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. The mind can play tricks on us, especially when we're half asleep, but we'll keep an eye out just in case. We spent the next hour combing the yard and the surrounding area, looking for any sign of the creature I'd seen. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the cool morning air, we found nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual signs of the local wildlife deer tracks, rabbit droppings, the occasional bird's nest. As we made our way back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The memory of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, was still vivid in my mind. The gray skin, the impossibly long arms, the inhuman speed. It all seemed too detailed, too specific to be a mere figment of my imagination. Over the next few days, life slowly returned to normal. I went about my daily routine, work, errands, social obligations, but always with a heightened sense of awareness. Every shadow seemed to hold the potential for danger. Every unexpected movement in my peripheral vision caused my heart to skip a beat. I found myself staying up late into the night, researching local folklore and unexplained phenomena. I scoured online forums and message boards, looking for anyone who might have had a similar experience. But while I found plenty of stories about strange sightings and unexplained events, none quite matched what I had seen that early morning. My dog, too, seemed to have been affected by the experience. He became more vigilant, more protective. His nightly routine of curling up next to me in bed now included frequent patrols to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside with an intensity that was both reassuring and unsettling. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the memory of that morning began to fade. Not entirely. I doubt I'll ever completely forget what I saw, but it became less immediate, less all-consuming. Life has a way of moving forward, of demanding our attention and focus, even in the face of the inexplicable. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night when the world is still and silent, I find myself lying awake, staring out at the yard where I saw that impossible figure. And I wonder, was it real? Was it some kind of hallucination, a waking dream? Or was it something else entirely, something that exists just beyond the edge of our understanding? I may never know the truth, but one thing is certain. That early morning experience changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that challenge our understanding of what is real and what is not. And so I remain vigilant. I keep my eyes open, my mind alert to the possibility of the impossible. Because who knows? Maybe someday, in the soft light of another dawn, I'll catch another glimpse of that mysterious figure. And this time, I'll be ready. As I sit here now recounting this story, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions. There's fear, of course. The memory of that morning still has the power to send a shiver down my spine. But there's also a sense of wonder, a newfound appreciation for the mysteries that surround us. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that there are some questions that may never have answers. But far from diminishing my world, this experience has expanded it. It has made me more open to possibilities, more willing to consider explanations that lie outside the realm of the ordinary. In the years since that morning, I've become something of an amateur investigator of the unexplained. I've collected stories from others who have had strange encounters, piecing together a patchwork of experiences that hint at a world far more complex and mysterious than most of us realize. Some might call it an obsession, but I prefer to think of it as a quest for understanding. Each new story, each unexplained event, feels like another piece of a vast, intricate puzzle. And while I may never see the full picture, The process of searching, of questioning, has become a vital part of who I am. The creature I saw that morning, if indeed it was a creature and not some trick of light and shadow, has never reappeared. At least not in a way that I can definitively confirm. But there have been moments, fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, unexplained sounds in the night, that make me wonder. My dog, loyal companion that he is, seems to sense these moments too. His ears will prick up, his body tensing as he stares intently at something I can't quite see. In these moments, I'm reminded that there are forms of perception that extend beyond our human senses, that perhaps our animal friends are attuned to aspects of reality that we can only dimly perceive. I've often wondered what would happen if I ever encountered that creature again. Would I react with fear, as I did that first time? Or would my curiosity overcome my terror, driving me to try to communicate, to understand? The truth is, I don't know. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of what keeps me going, what drives me to continue my investigations. There's a thrill in not knowing, in standing at the edge of the unknown, and peering into the darkness beyond. As I write these words, the sun is setting outside my window. Soon night will fall, and with it will come the possibilities that darkness brings. Who knows what mysteries the night might hold, what secrets might be revealed in the soft light of the moon, or in the gray hours just before dawn. It was a balmy evening in late summer, the kind where the warmth of the day lingers well into the night, promising an ideal setting for a beach camping trip. My husband and I had been planning this getaway for weeks, eager to spend quality time with his daughter and her fiancé. The young couple had recently shared the joyous news of their pregnancy, and we saw this as an opportunity to celebrate and bond before their lives changed forever. We arrived at the beach in the late afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the sand and sea. The air was filled with the salty scent of the ocean, mixed with the earthy aroma of driftwood scattered along the shoreline. As we unloaded our gear from the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mingled with nostalgia. This very beach held a special place in my heart, as it was where we had scattered my father's ashes years ago. He had always loved this stretch of coastline, finding solace in the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. Setting up camp was a team effort. My husband and his daughter's fiancé tackled the tents while she and I organized our supplies and prepared a simple picnic dinner. We laughed and chatted as we worked, the sound of our voices mingling with the cries of seagulls overhead. Once everything was in place, we settled down on a large blanket spread across the sand, eagerly diving into our feast of sandwiches, fresh fruits, and homemade cookies. As we ate, we shared stories and dreams for the future. My stepdaughter, her hand resting gently on her still flat stomach, spoke of her hopes for the baby and the kind of parents she and her fiancé aspired to be. My husband and I offered words of encouragement and advice, drawing from our own experiences. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by bursts of laughter and moments of comfortable silence. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, we found ourselves captivated by the spectacular display of colors painting the sky. Shades of orange, pink, and purple stretched across the canvas of clouds, reflected in the calm surface of the ocean. We sat in awe, watching as the fiery orb slowly dipped below the waterline, leaving behind a palette of deep blues and purples. With darkness settling in, we lit a small campfire, careful to follow the beach's regulations. The crackling flames cast a warm glow over our little circle, and we huddled closer, sharing ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. The night air had cooled considerably, and I found myself grateful for the extra layers we had packed. Despite the cozy atmosphere and the joy of being with family, an inexplicable unease began to creep over me. At first I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings, or perhaps some lingering anxiety about sleeping outdoors. But as the night wore on, the feeling only intensified. It was as if a heavy weight had settled on my chest, making it difficult to breathe easily or fully enjoy the moment. I glanced at my husband, wondering if I should voice my concerns. To my surprise, I caught him looking at me with a furrowed brow, his eyes reflecting a similar disquiet. Still, neither of us said anything, not wanting to dampen the spirits of our companions or seem overly cautious. Eventually, as the fire died down to glowing embers, we decided to call it a night. We extinguished the flames properly, ensuring not a spark remained, and retreated to our respective tents. As I lay in the darkness listening to the sound of waves lapping at the shore, I found myself unable to relax. Every rustle of the tent fabric in the breeze, every distant call of a night bird, seemed to set my nerves on edge. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I finally turned to my husband and whispered, "Are you awake?" "Yeah," he replied softly. "Can't sleep either?" I hesitated for a moment before confessing, "I have this awful feeling. I can't shake it, like something's wrong." To my relief, he didn't dismiss my concerns. Instead, he reached out and squeezed my hand. "I know what you mean. I've been feeling it too. I thought I was just being paranoid." We lay there in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, my husband spoke again. "Maybe we should go home. I know it might seem silly, but if we're both feeling this way, there must be a reason." I nodded, grateful that he understood. "But what about the kids? We don't want to ruin their trip." "Let me talk to them," he said, already unzipping the tent. "They might be feeling the same way." I watched as he slipped out into the night, his silhouette briefly visible against the starry sky before he disappeared towards the other tent. The wait seemed interminable, my mind conjuring all sorts of scenarios to explain our shared unease. Was there a storm coming that we hadn't anticipated? Had we unknowingly set up camp in a dangerous area? Before I could spiral further into worry, my husband was back, his movements urgent. "They felt it too," he said, his voice a mix of relief and concern. "We're packing up. Now." What followed was a flurry of activity, all four of us working in near silence to break down our campsite. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared urgency that needed no explanation. We moved with purpose, our earlier leisurely pace replaced by efficient, almost frantic motion. As we worked, I couldn't help but notice how the beach seemed different now. The darkness that had earlier felt cozy and intimate now seemed oppressive, hiding unknown threats. The sound of the waves, once soothing, now carried an ominous tone. Even the stars above, which had earlier inspired wonder, now seemed cold and distant. My stepdaughter and I finished our tasks first and retreated to the car, both of us feeling safer within its confines. As we sat there, watching the men pack the last of the gear, I found myself holding my breath, willing them to move faster. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, every sound a possible threat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the guys approached the car, their arms full of the last bits of camping equipment. As they neared, a sound cut through the night, the roar of an engine, growing louder by the second. Before we could react, a massive white truck materialized out of the darkness, its headlights blinding us momentarily. It tore across the beach, kicking up sand in its wake, and plowed through the exact spot where our tents had stood mere minutes ago. The truck's lifted frame would have easily crushed our small camping setup, and us along with it. For a moment we all sat in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, the men hurriedly threw the remaining gear into the car and jumped in. My husband started the engine with shaking hands, and we sped away from the beach, all of us stealing glances in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck in pursuit. As we drove home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, I couldn't help but reflect on the night's events. What force had compelled us all to leave when we did? Was it mere coincidence or something more? My mind drifted to thoughts of my father, whose ashes rested on that very beach. Had his spirit somehow been watching over us, warning us of the danger to come? The drive home seemed both interminable and over in an instant. As we pulled into our driveway, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. We unloaded the car in silence, too exhausted and shaken to do more than pile the gear in the garage to be dealt with later. Before parting ways, we gathered in a tight group hug, the reality of our near miss hitting us all at once. Tears were shed, words of gratitude exchanged, and promises made to always trust our instincts in the future. In the days and weeks that followed, we found ourselves discussing that night often, trying to make sense of what had happened. We learned later from local news that there had been reports of reckless driving on the beaches in that area, with several close calls reported by other campers. The knowledge that we weren't alone in our experience brought little comfort, only reinforcing how lucky we had been. For my stepdaughter and her fiancé, the incident seemed to bring a new perspective on their impending parenthood. The fragility of life, so starkly demonstrated that night, made them even more determined to cherish every moment and to create a safe, loving environment for their child. As for my husband and me, we found our bond strengthened by the shared experience. We became more attuned to each other's feelings and instincts, vowing never again to ignore that gut feeling when it arose. We also developed a deeper appreciation for the unpredictability of life and the importance of making the most of every day we're given. We never returned to beach camping after that night. The memory of our close call was too vivid, too raw, but we didn't let it deter us from enjoying the outdoors altogether. Instead, we found new ways to connect with nature, choosing safer locations, and always staying alert to our surroundings. Years have passed since that fateful night, and life has moved on in many ways. My stepdaughter's baby, born healthy and strong, is now a curious toddler who loves to hear stories of our adventures. We've shared many more family trips and created countless happy memories, but none of us have forgotten that summer night on the beach when trusting our instincts may have saved our lives. To this day, I sometimes find myself standing at the edge of the ocean, looking out over the waves and thinking of my father. I wonder if he was there with us that night, a guardian spirit steering us away from harm. Whether it was his influence, some collective intuition, or simply luck, I'll always be grateful for whatever force compelled us to leave when we did. I've always been a light sleeper. The faintest noise can rouse me from the deepest slumber, so it wasn't surprising when I first sensed a presence in my room. It was a frigid winter night when a cool breeze brushed against my skin, stirring me awake. Initially, I dismissed it as a draft from the window, but as my eyes fluttered open, I saw him standing at the foot of my bed. The man was tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to peer directly into my soul. His presence was simultaneously comforting and unsettling. I tried to speak, to inquire about his identity and intentions, but my voice failed me. I could only watch in silence as he moved closer, a gentle smile playing on his lips. As days turned into weeks, the man began visiting me every night. Sometimes he would sit silently by my bedside, watching over me as I slept. Other times he would stroke my hair and whisper soothing words in my ear. I gradually grew accustomed to his nightly visits, finding solace in his presence during those lonely hours of darkness. Despite his calming demeanor, an air of mystery surrounded the man. I could never quite shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. There were nights when he would vanish without a trace, leaving me to wonder if he had ever been real or if he was merely a figment of my imagination. One particular night, as I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, the man appeared before me in a shimmering light. His ethereal form glowed with a soft radiance, casting a warm glow over the room. It was then that I realized he was not of this world, that he was something beyond human comprehension. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. "I am a guardian of the night," he replied, his voice like a gentle breeze caressing my skin. "I watch over those who need me, guiding them through the darkness." His words left me both awestruck and terrified. What did he mean by guiding me through the darkness? Was there something lurking in the shadows that I was unaware of? As the nights passed, the man revealed more of himself to me. He shared stories of ancient times, of battles fought and victories won. He spoke of the secrets of the universe, of how the stars aligned and the planets danced in harmony. I listened intently, hanging on to his every word like a lost soul seeking redemption. But as much as I yearned to know him better, there was always a part of him that remained elusive. He would vanish into thin air without warning, leaving me to question if he had ever been there at all. One night, as I lay in bed bathed in the glow of the moonlight, the man spoke to me in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "It is time for you to face your fears," he said, his eyes shining with an otherworldly light. "There is darkness within you that must be confronted, a shadow that threatens to consume you if left unchecked." A chill ran down my spine at his words. What darkness was he referring to? Was there a part of me that I was unaware of, lurking beneath the surface like a dormant volcano waiting to erupt? The man reached out a hand towards me, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through my body. I could feel the power surging through me, awakening something deep within my soul. "Do not be afraid," he whispered, his voice like a gentle caress. "Embrace the darkness within you, for only then can you truly be free." With those words, the man vanished into the night, leaving me to ponder his cryptic message. I lay in bed for hours, my mind racing with thoughts and emotions that I could not explain. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to the darkness like a moth to a flame. I delved into the deepest recesses of my mind, searching for the source of the shadow that the man had spoken of. And as I confronted my fears head-on, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me like a cleansing tide. I no longer feared the darkness within me, for I knew that it was a part of who I was. As I embraced my true self, I felt the man's presence fade away, his nightly visits coming to an end. But I will always remember the man who visited me every night, the guardian of the night who showed me the true meaning of courage and self-discovery. And as I drift off to sleep each night, I know that he will always be watching over me from the shadows, guiding me through the darkness with a gentle hand and a kind heart. The experience with the mysterious nightly visitor left an indelible mark on my life. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself grappling with the implications of what had transpired. The line between reality and imagination became increasingly blurred, and I often caught myself questioning my own sanity. I began to pay more attention to the world around me, noticing details that I had previously overlooked. The way shadows danced on the walls, the whispers of the wind through the trees, the subtle shifts in the air that seemed to herald the approach of something unseen. All of these took on new significance in light of my nocturnal encounters. My friends and family noticed the change in me. They commented on my newfound introspection, the way I seemed to be constantly lost in thought. I couldn't bring myself to share the truth with them. How could I explain the nightly visits from a mysterious guardian, the cryptic messages about facing my inner darkness? I knew they would think I had lost my mind. Instead, I threw myself into research. I spent countless hours in libraries poring over ancient texts and obscure manuscripts. I delved into mythology, psychology, and philosophy, searching for any clues that might help me make sense of what I had experienced. I became particularly fascinated with Jungian psychology and the concept of the shadow self. the hidden aspects of our personality that we often repress or deny. As I explored these ideas, I began to understand what the mysterious man had meant about confronting the darkness within me. We all have aspects of ourselves that we're afraid to face, our fears, our insecurities, our deepest desires. By acknowledging and integrating these shadow elements, we can achieve a greater sense of wholeness and self-acceptance. This realization led me on a journey of intense self-reflection. I started keeping a dream journal, recording every detail I could remember upon waking. I practiced meditation, learning to quiet my mind and listen to the whispers of my subconscious. I even sought out a therapist, someone who could help me navigate the complex landscape of my psyche. Through this process, I uncovered parts of myself that I had long buried or ignored. I confronted childhood traumas, faced long-held fears, and acknowledged desires that I had been too ashamed to admit even to myself. It was a painful and often frightening journey, but with each step, I felt myself growing stronger, more whole. As I delved deeper into my inner world, I began to notice subtle changes in my outer reality as well. The world seemed to take on a new vibrancy, colors appearing more vivid, sounds more crisp. I found myself more attuned to the emotions of those around me, picking up on subtle cues that I had previously missed. There were moments when I thought I caught glimpses of the mysterious man out of the corner of my eye. A tall figure disappearing around a corner, a fleeting reflection in a window. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. These occurrences left me with a mix of excitement and unease, a reminder that there was still so much about my experience that I didn't understand. One night, about a year after the visits had stopped, I had a vivid dream. In it, I found myself standing on the edge of a vast, dark forest. The mysterious man stood beside me, his blue eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "You have come far," he said, his voice carrying on the night breeze. "But your journey is not yet complete." He gestured towards the forest, and I felt a pull, an inexorable urge to step into the darkness. As I took my first step, I felt his hand on my shoulder. "Remember," he said, "the darkness is not to be feared, but understood. It is a part of you, as much as the light." With those words, I plunged into the forest. The dream that followed was a kaleidoscope of images and sensations, running through dark woods, confronting shadowy figures, discovering hidden clearings bathed in moonlight. When I awoke, I felt as though I had lived a lifetime in that dream world. The dream stayed with me, its imagery and emotions lingering long after I had opened my eyes. I realized that my journey of self-discovery was far from over. The mysterious man, whether he was a real entity, a manifestation of my subconscious, or something in between, had set me on a path that would likely last a lifetime. In the years that followed, I continued to explore the depths of my psyche. I sought out new experiences, pushing myself out of my comfort zone and embracing the unknown. I traveled to far-flung corners of the world, immersing myself in different cultures and ways of thinking. I tried my hand at various forms of artistic expression, painting, writing, music, finding new ways to give voice to the parts of myself that I was still discovering. Through it all, I never forgot the lessons I had learned from my nightly visitor. I learned to embrace the duality within myself, the light and the dark, the known and the unknown. I came to understand that true strength comes not from denying our shadows, but from integrating them into our whole selves. As I sit here now, years later, I can look back on that strange period of my life with a sense of gratitude. The mysterious man who visited me in the night set me on a path of self-discovery that has enriched my life in ways I could never have imagined. He taught me to look beyond the surface, to question my assumptions, and to find beauty and meaning in the darkest corners of existence. I still have nights when I lie awake, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see a tall figure materialize at the foot of my bed. And while those visitations have long since ceased, I carry with me the knowledge that there is more to this world and to ourselves than meets the eye. The darkness no longer frightens me. Instead, it intrigues me, challenges me, invites me to explore its depths. For I know now that it is in facing our shadows that we truly come to know ourselves. And in that knowledge lies a power and a freedom that I never could have imagined before that first fateful night when a stranger appeared in my room. I grew up immersed in the natural beauty of the Sierra Nevada mountains, spending countless days camping and backpacking with my family. Those early experiences instilled in me a deep love for the wilderness and a confidence in my outdoor skills that would shape my future adventures. As I entered my early 20s, I felt ready to take on a new challenge: solo wilderness hikes that would push my limits and test my mettle against the raw power of nature. These weren't casual day hikes or weekend trips. I embarked on epic journeys lasting weeks at a time, traversing vast stretches of untamed wilderness. One such expedition began with my father dropping me off at a remote trailhead just outside Yosemite National Park. My destination? Smith Valley, Nevada. A grueling 3-week trek through some of the most rugged and breathtaking terrain the American West has to offer. While these solo adventures were exhilarating, I never took unnecessary risks. Meticulous planning went into every aspect of my trips. I carried a GPS locator with emergency communication capabilities, ensuring I could reach out to my family if the need arose. My routes were carefully mapped out, with contingency plans for various scenarios. And as a precaution against the very real threat of rattlesnakes in the region, I always packed a pistol loaded with snake shot in the first 2 chambers. On this particular journey, I had decided to fully embrace the wilderness experience by foregoing a tent. My shelter consisted of nothing more than a sleeping bag beneath the vast canopy of stars. It was a choice that would soon test my resolve in ways I couldn't have imagined. 3 days into the hike, I found myself beside a serene mountain lake as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks. The day's exertions weighed heavy on my muscles, and I was looking forward to settling in for the night. As I prepared to stand and set up my minimalist camp, a movement caught my eye. My heart nearly stopped as I raised my gaze to meet the piercing stare of a mountain lion, barely 20 feet away. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. The sheer power and grace of the predator before me was awe-inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of wilderness training kept me rooted to the spot. I knew that fleeing would only trigger the lion's chase response, turning me from a potential threat into prey. With deliberate slowness, I eased back onto the rock where I had been sitting. My hand moved carefully to my holstered pistol, but I made no sudden movements. The reality of my situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was utterly alone, at least 40 miles from the nearest hint of civilization. The pistol offered some comfort, but I harbored no illusions about its effectiveness against such a formidable opponent. At best, the noise might startle the lion enough to give it pause. In that moment of intense vulnerability, an odd sense of calm washed over me. Perhaps it was the surge of adrenaline, or maybe some primal part of my brain kicking into survival mode. Whatever the reason, I found myself doing something completely unexpected. I started talking to the mountain lion. My voice, surprisingly steady, filled the tense silence between us. I spoke of my day's journey, describing the breathtaking vistas I'd encountered and the challenges I'd overcome. As the lion began to pace slowly, never breaking its intense gaze, I commented on the weather and even cracked a nervous joke about looking for a good meal that didn't involve anything bipedal. This surreal, one-sided conversation continued for what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than a minute or 2. The mountain lion's movements were deliberate and graceful, a potent reminder of the raw power coiled within its muscular frame. Just when I thought my nerve might finally break, The magnificent creature turned away with casual indifference and melted into the gathering shadows. Even after the immediate threat had passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For a good 20 minutes I continued to talk, my voice growing hoarse as the adrenaline slowly ebbed from my system. Exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave, but sleep would prove elusive that night. I clutched my knife in one hand and the pistol in the other, my senses hyper-alert to every rustle and whisper of the wilderness around me. When dawn finally broke, it felt as though I had only blinked. The encounter with the mountain lion had shaken me, but it had also filled me with a profound sense of respect for the wild and unpredictable nature of my surroundings. Little did I know, the true test of my survival skills was yet to come. As I continued my journey, an unprecedented heat wave descended upon the region. The temperature soared to an unbelievable 105 degrees Fahrenheit, even at an elevation of 10,000 feet. This sudden and extreme shift in weather conditions presented a new and potentially deadly challenge. Water sources that had been reliably marked on my maps began to vanish overnight, evaporating under the relentless sun. I knew of some natural springs in the area, but they lay far off my planned route. Reaching them would require a grueling 20-mile detour. With my supplies already stretched thin, I made the difficult decision to push on towards my rendezvous point, hoping to find water along the way. Despite my best efforts to conserve energy, I found myself arriving at the pickup location a full day ahead of schedule. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a welcome development. However, a cruel twist of fate was about to turn my early arrival into a fight for survival. My father, who was supposed to meet me, had encountered his own setback. A blown tire had delayed him by nearly 24 hours. To compound the problem, the water source I had been counting on at our meeting point had completely dried up. I now faced the grim prospect of enduring 60 to 72 hours in blistering heat at high elevation, with no reliable water source. Desperation fueled my creativity. I cobbled together a makeshift solar still using materials from my pack, and I wrapped plastic bags around plants to collect precious drops of condensation. These improvised methods yielded only the barest trickle of moisture, just enough to keep me clinging to life, but far from sufficient to stave off the increasingly severe effects of dehydration. As the hours crawled by, my physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The relentless heat and lack of water took a heavy toll on my body and mind. Hallucinations began to set in, blurring the line between reality and fevered imagination. I found myself having conversations with rocks and trees, convinced they held the secret to finding water. At times I could swear I heard the distant rumble of my father's truck, only to have my hopes dashed as the sound faded into the shimmering heat haze. Just when I felt I could endure no more, salvation arrived in the form of my father's battered pickup truck. The sight of him emerging from the vehicle, arms laden with life-giving fluids, is forever etched in my memory. He had come prepared, bringing not only a case of Gatorade and vitamin water, but also a cooler packed with ice and protein bars. I gulped down the cool liquids with a desperation I had never known before, feeling strength slowly seep back into my parched body. As a precaution, we made a stop in Carson City to have me checked out by a doctor. While I had pushed my body to its limits, the prompt rehydration and care had fortunately prevented any lasting damage. Reflecting on the experience, I realized there was little I could have done differently to prepare for such an extreme and unexpected situation. The weather forecast had given no indication of the impending heat wave, and water sources that had been reliable for generations had failed in a matter of days. It was a stark reminder of nature's unpredictable power and the importance of respecting the wilderness, no matter how experienced one might be. This harrowing adventure marked a turning point in my approach to solo wilderness expeditions. While my passion for the outdoors remained undiminished, I gained a newfound appreciation for the concerns of my loved ones. my wife in particular, made it clear that she could no longer bear the anxiety of my extended solitary treks. In the years that followed, I found ways to balance my thirst for adventure with the need for greater safety measures. I began to explore new outdoor challenges that allowed me to push my limits while keeping connected to civilization. Group expeditions, shorter solo trips with more frequent check-ins, and even leading wilderness survival courses became new outlets for my passion. The memories of that fateful trip, the face-to-face encounter with the mountain lion, the desperate struggle against dehydration, and the overwhelming relief of rescue, remain vivid reminders of both the awe-inspiring beauty and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. They serve as powerful testaments to the importance of preparation, respect for nature, and the unbreakable bonds of family that can pull us through even the most daunting challenges.